A tale of two universities and how they responded to the Supreme Court's decision to ban race and ethnicity based preferences in college admissions. That is the topic of today's video. My name is Craig Meister. I'm a college admissions coach. You can learn more about me and how you can work with me one-on-one throughout the entire college admissions process on my website, which is collegemeister.com. And if you're interested in learning about whether or not you are or your student is on track for selective college admission in the United States of America, visit areyouontracktogetin.com. Again, that's areyouontracktogetin.com, at which you will complete a free 3-minute assessment. Your results will be emailed to you right away, and they will help you clarify whether or not you are or your student is on track for selective college admission in the United States of America. The two universities we're going to be taking a deep dive into today are Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. These are actually pretty similar university selectivity-wise. They are pretty similar in size. One has about 6,000 undergrads, one has almost 9,000 undergrads. And they are also schools that are strong in engineering. They're also both private schools. And they also, for years, have been associated with similar review processes, at least outwardly known review processes. But what we're going to be diving into today is going to show that these two universities arrived at a fork in the road after the Supreme Court decision to ban race and ethnicity-based preferences in college admissions. And one chose to go one way, down one side of the fork in the road, and the other chose to go the other way in terms of the other side of the fork in the road. Let's take a deep dive first into Hopkins. Hopkins is in Baltimore, Maryland. It's in a city. It is in the Northeast corridor. Some would say it's the northernmost southern city and the southernmost northern city. But whatever you may characterize Baltimore as, it is also home to Johns Hopkins University. It's class of 2027, the last class accepted in the earlier regime of affirmative action being in use. There were 38,294 applicants, and 1,306 students ultimately enrolled. And Johns Hopkins was test optional for this year, and they were optional again for the first year within the new regime. Members of Johns Hopkins class of 2027, we see that 14% were African American or Black, 29% were Asian American, 20% are what are being called Hispanic/Latine, and 14% were international, 2% were Native American, 1% were Pacific Islander, 2% were unknown, and 18% were white or Caucasian. Now let's fast forward to the first year again of the new regime, the first admissions cycle Johns Hopkins had to operate under after affirmative action was effectively banned in the United States or outlawed in the United States in college admission. There were many more applications, 45,134. That's a big increase from 38,294. And ultimately 1,288 students enrolled. So actually fewer students enrolled at Hopkins, even though they got a good number of applications greater during that first post-affirmative action admission cycle. In terms of the scores, similar scores than that they've been having in the test optional environment. Just so you know, Johns Hopkins is going back to test required for those students entering fall 2026. They are currently test recommended or encouraged, but test required for the next cycle. Taking a look at race ethnicity breakdown for the class of 2028, we see that Asian students are 46% of Johns Hopkins entering class of 2028. That's an increase from what was listed as Asian American the year before of 29%. Now Black is 5.7% for the class of 2028. Remember, it was 14% African American/Black the year before. Hispanic is 10.7% in the class of 2028. The class of 2027 was 20% Hispanic/Latine, if you recall. And white is now 34%. And before that, the year before, it was only 18%. So, just so you know, Johns Hopkins really did not change any outward facing elements of the admissions process from one year to the next. It still reviewed students primarily via the Common App. It still obviously reviewed the Common App essay as a requirement of the Common App. It also reviewed one short answer response on the Johns Hopkins supplement for both cycles in question. So the real change was what they were allowed to do behind the scenes in terms of considering race and ethnicity. Johns Hopkins did have a greater number of applications from one year to the next, and it's unlikely that all of those new applicants were white and Asian. So I don't believe that is the reason why Johns Hopkins all of a sudden has a first year entering class that is much whiter and much more Asian. I think, in fact, it is because of what they were allowed to consider and the individuals in the office following through on the way in which they interpreted the Supreme Court ruling. That's basically it. These are real people making real decisions about real other people. And this is how it panned out at Johns Hopkins. The international numbers did not really change much at all. It went actually up 1 percentage point. And that's where we will leave Johns Hopkins for now. Now let's take a look at Northwestern University. Northwestern, for its class of 2027, reports its facts and figures a little bit differently. They had 52,233 applicants. They had an admit rate of 7.2%, and their first year entering class ultimately was 2,112 students. In terms of how these students identify in Northwestern's last class that was considered under affirmative action, 29.3% self-identified as Asian American or Pacific Islander, 14.2% Black or African American, 17.2% Hispanic or Latinx or Latin, and 10.5% international, and 47.8% white. And so you also see some other numbers as they define it, BIPOC and so forth. So again, they use slightly different reporting mechanisms over at Northwestern. But let's take a look at the first class post affirmative action being outlawed in the United States for college admissions. We see that there were 50,000. So they actually had a slight drop in applications. 7.6 admit rate. So the admit rate actually went up ever so slightly from 7.2% to 7.6% from one cycle to the next. And then we also had 2,105 students make up the first year entering class for the class of 2028. That's slightly fewer students than the year before. And in terms of breakdown of race and ethnicity, 26% now identified as Asian American or Pacific Islander. That number actually dropped. That's so fascinating. It dropped, whereas at Hopkins, it rose. So it dropped about 3 percentage points. For Black or African American, that number, it rose just ever so slightly to 15%. Maybe it really didn't rise that much. It was probably 14.7% or something, rounded up. But whatever the case is, it's officially higher than it was last year, 14.2% last year. This year, it is 15%, or for the class of 2028. And then 18% for Hispanic or Latinx. We see the year before it was 17.2% when they used to report with decimals. Native indigenous numbers actually also went up 1 percentage point officially from 2 to 3%. The white number went down from 47.8% for the class of 2027 to 43% for the class of 2028. And they are now also reporting did not report at 6%. And of course, there are individuals in both years who identify as multiple races and ethnicities. So you do have to understand that. That's why the totals do arrive at a number greater than 100. The BIPOC number was reported as slightly lower, though, from the year before, 56% for the class of 2028, whereas the year before it was 57.4%. But as you saw, the individual itemized races and ethnicities, the Asian American numbers went down, the white numbers went down, Hispanic, Black numbers went up ever so slightly. So this is basically the reverse of what we saw at Johns Hopkins. Now you say, why is this happening, Craig? How did this happen? Is there just more demand from certain races or ethnicities for the Chicago area, Chicagoland versus Baltimore? No, that's not what happened. What I do know that did happen outwardly facing is that Northwestern made the decision to not require the Common App essay for members of the class of 2028. So, of all selective colleges and universities in the United States, I would say that Northwestern is the most selective college or university that completely dropped requiring students to submit their Common App essay to them or have it reviewed. You could submit it to them and it would be reviewed if you wanted it to be, but it did not have to be. So that was one notable change from the admissions process from one year to the next. Also having these optional essays that Northwestern started to have, that you could do some of them, you could do only one of them. You could do, I think, up to 3, I believe, if I recall, versus only 1. And of the 5 optional essay prompts, they all could be used to convey information about one's identity or background, as well as share information about a student's experiences vis-a-vis one's identity, background, diversity, etc. So I think that's really important to note. Again, of the 5 that were optional, there was 1 that was not optional, but the other 5 were optional, and you could only do up to 2 of the 5 that were optional. So Northwestern had much more flexibility with writing than Johns Hopkins had. Even though the overall number of words total you could write for Johns Hopkins was lower than the overall number of words you could write for Northwestern, Northwestern had that flexibility to review a lot of writing from an applicant or quite a little writing from an applicant. So that is something to sort of note as a way in which Northwestern was able to have greater flexibility with reviewing applicants from one year to the next that Johns Hopkins did not give itself. Now, the other thing I will note, though, is that, like I said before, Johns Hopkins is ultimately run by people, as is Northwestern. Real people with beating hearts and minds that operate constantly, right? These are real people. And so the individuals making the admissions decisions are ultimately the ones you have to look to, the actual individuals. And what you see at Northwestern is that in a very similar school to Johns Hopkins, that the people populating the admissions office at Northwestern ideologically are very different from the people who hold sway and are populating the admissions office at Johns Hopkins. That's the only thing you can say for sure, because they interpreted the Supreme Court decision entirely differently than the individuals at Johns Hopkins. And they also had the latitude to interpret it the way they ultimately wanted to interpret it, because they lowered the bar on writing on their application and were able to ignore more writing than Johns Hopkins could ignore in terms of that Common App essay. Now, with that said, as we know, different schools are already judging writing very differently depending on where you're applying to or how, but it's possible that Johns Hopkins did not fully implement an equitable review process, and it's possible that the Northwestern University did. And that, coupled with the fact that there are literally different pieces of the pie being reviewed for different applicants at Northwestern, there's greater diversity of what is being reviewed when a Common App essay is being submitted for some applicants but not for others. There's a much wider range of ways in which you can view an applicant in that environment at Northwestern than that you could view it at Johns Hopkins. So again, I would make the argument that the reason these two institutions went down different forks in the road, or different, I guess, spokes of the fork is what you would refer to it as, or different pieces, of the fork, you get my point, is because ultimately the people running the offices, the Northwestern office, the Northwestern University Admissions Office, is run by ideologically strident individuals who believe very strongly in the power of maintaining the demographics as much as possible the way they want to maintain the demographics. And I would make the argument that ultimately there are demographic goals at Northwestern, as it was at Johns Hopkins for many years, was to have as few white and Asian students as possible. Northwestern was able and did continue to execute on that goal. Whereas Johns Hopkins, while that still may be the goal of individuals at Johns Hopkins, from one year to the next, they did not have the freedom in their own minds, and also they did not implement a review process that could give them the latitude necessary to with a straight face, maintain the numbers that they wanted to maintain. And so that's why you see certain numbers fluctuate quite wildly at Johns Hopkins, whereas at Northwestern, the numbers are pretty much steady, though actually ended up tipping in the scales toward the long range goals that they've been working to for many years at Northwestern, which is reduce the number of whites, reduce the number of Asians so as to make more room with every passing year for more Hispanic and more Black students. Whereas at Johns Hopkins, that's been a goal, stated overtly or not, but it was not something they could end up following through on any longer, ultimately because the people running the office just couldn't do it. They couldn't justify it with the tools that they had at their disposal. Maybe, again, they will start to justify it over time. They will find different ways. Like I said, maybe they will drop reviewing certain elements of the application or put different weights on different elements of the application to adjust for this. And one of the ways in which, again, we know schools have adjusted for this already, they're saying it overtly, is by looking at test scores subjectively as opposed to objectively, like they always had for many years. So that, again, is what I call equitable review, which is they have different standards for different applicants depending on something. Again, it's not officially supposed to be race or ethnicity. It's probably in many cases, whether you go to a public school versus a private school in an urban area versus an area with a high income zip code, if you will. They're going to find backdoor ways to try to implement the same results that affirmative action was producing. Whether or not that is legal, again, that is another fight for another day, another discussion for another day, because we now also have an administration in the White House that is much more aggressively going to be trying to police whether or not colleges are actually following not only the letter of the Supreme Court ruling, but also the spirit of the Supreme Court ruling. Whereas, again, a year ago, we did not have the same administration. So it'll be interesting to see how colleges react to that, also coupled with the fact that even just this week, the new administration has already indicated a real keen interest in dismantling the DEI infrastructure that has been developed over the last 5 to 15 years formally. Obviously, ideologically, it was in place for much longer than the last 15 years, but formally, it really structured and built sturdily over the last 5 to 15 years in both government and across both public and private universities and colleges in the United States of America. So it'll be very interesting to see how colleges do move forward and how these numbers change at Northwestern and Johns Hopkins for its class of 2029. I would not at all be surprised to see these numbers deflate a little bit or change a little bit more toward the Hopkins direction at Northwestern. And similarly, I would not be surprised if at Hopkins, the numbers move a little bit more toward where Northwestern was this year for the class of 2029, just depending, again, on the personalities involved, the internal pressures that bosses, line managers are giving to those who report to them, so on and so forth. But also now, again, the big elephant in the room is the GOP is now running the federal government, whereas last year that was not the case. And so particularly Trump's administration is keen to dismantle DEI. And so they will be paying very close attention to how not just these two universities, but also colleges and universities across the United States, as I said, public and private, are going to be, what they're going to look like demographically. And what we see is a fascinating case study today, again, in how Northwestern and Johns Hopkins ultimately went down different roads, different paths, mainly because, again, of the people in those offices. Both offices are pretty liberal offices, but one was willing to keep going with that, and one couldn't do it any longer, and they had to pull back from the direction that they had been marching toward for many years. So it's very interesting. We will see how this plays out, but the data is out there, and the data will continue to be dissected. As we wrap things up, I want to remind you that you don't have to settle for the free videos alone. As you navigate the college admissions process, get the focused and personalized coaching and expertise you need to achieve your goals. My Smart Sessions meet you where you are in order to take you where you want to go. Meanwhile, if you want proactive support throughout the college application process and want to collaborate with a dedicated expert to submit applications that are simply meticulous, Reserve your preferred Simply Meticulous experience as soon as possible. Space is limited due to the time and attention to detail required to pull off these extraordinary coaching experiences. No matter your distinctive objectives, you can achieve them. If you'd like to work with me one-on-one, visit my website, which is collegemeister.com. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. As mentioned previously, if you'd like to work with me one-on-one throughout the college admissions process, visit my website, which is collegemeister.com. Until next time, stay safe, stay well, and most importantly, stay stress-free throughout the entire college admissions process.